On an ordinary day, inside a bustling courthouse, a police officer made a reckless decision, grabbing a woman he thought didn't belong. But what he didn't know, that woman was a sitting judge. Now, the man who once believed he was above the law is about to face the very justice system he thought he controlled. What will happen when the badge that once protected him becomes the reason for his downfall? Stay tuned to find out. And before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. The Grand Chicago Courthouse was alive with the hum of anticipation. The air buzzed with hushed conversations, the rustle of legal documents, and the clicking of polished dress shoes against marble floors. Lawyers, clerks, and officers moved with purpose, their faces etched with determination or fatigue. In the midst of it all, Aisha Carter stood tall, exuding quiet confidence. Dressed in a sharp burgundy suit, she scrolled through her phone, her expression unreadable. Her posture was poised, her presence commanding. Yet to the untrained eye, she was just another black woman in the courthouse, someone easy to overlook. That's exactly what Officer Bradley Knox saw. Knox was a veteran cop, known for his tough stance and no-nonsense attitude. He had spent years patrolling these halls, his presence enough to make people move aside. To him, authority was everything, and he expected obedience without question. When he noticed Aisha standing near the restricted section of the courthouse, something about her irritated him. She looked too comfortable, too sure of herself. People like her always acted entitled. He approached, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "Ma'am, step back. This area is restricted," he ordered, his voice firm and laced with impatience. Aisha didn't move. She simply lifted her eyes from her phone and met his gaze. There was no fear, no hesitation, just quiet observation. Knox's irritation flared. "Did you hear me? I said step back," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. A few people turned their heads. Something about the moment felt off. Still, Aisha didn't react the way he expected. She remained calm, composed. "I have business here," she said evenly. Knox's jaw tightened. He had seen this game before, people pushing back just enough to test him. "I don't care what business you have. If you don't have clearance, you don't belong here." "And if I do have clearance?" Aisha asked, tilting her head slightly. Knox took a step forward, towering over her. "Then show me proof. Otherwise, step outside before I remove you myself." For the first time, Aisha's expression shifted. Just slightly. Not fear, not defiance. Something else. Something Knox didn't understand. The tension thickened. The air grew heavy. Then, in a single calculated movement, Knox reached out and grabbed her arm. Gasps echoed through the hallway. The murmur of the crowd turned into an uneasy hum. Still, Aisha barely moved under his grip. But something in the air shifted. Something powerful. She looked directly into his eyes. Her voice was calm but firm. "Let go. Office me." And for the first time in his career, Officer Bradley Knox felt something he wasn't used to: doubt. For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to pause. The murmur of voices in the courthouse faded. The steady rhythm of footsteps halted, and all eyes turned toward the confrontation, unfolding in the middle of the hallway. Officer Bradley Knox felt the weight of their stares, but it didn't matter. He had been in situations like this before, moments where his authority was questioned, where people hesitated before following orders. He always handled them the same way, with force and control. This woman was no different. His grip on her arm tightened, just enough to remind her who was in charge. "I told you to step back," he growled. But Aisha Carter didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze steady. "And I told you," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Let go of me." Knox's jaw clenched. He hated the way she looked at him, like he was the one making a mistake. "You're obstructing justice," he snapped. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to detain you." Aisha's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in something else, something dangerous. "On what charge, officer?" she asked smoothly. Knox hesitated. He hadn't expected the question. Normally, when he issued a command, people followed it. But this woman, she wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. "Failure to comply with an officer's orders," he shot back. Aisha raised an eyebrow. "Last I checked, standing still wasn't a crime." The hallway was deadly silent now. The small crowd that had gathered watched with bated breath. A clerk in the distance was gripping a stack of papers so tightly that they crumpled in her hands. Even some of Knox's fellow officers had stopped what they were doing to see how this would unfold. Knox felt his blood pressure rise. He was losing control of the situation, and he didn't like it. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, then reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at the main hall." "Don't bother." Aisha's voice sliced through the tension like a knife. Knox's head snapped toward her. She took a deliberate step forward, forcing him to either release his grip or escalate the situation in full view of everyone watching. He let go. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked. Knox felt a flicker of something, uncertainty, but he buried it. "I don't care who you are," he shot back. "This is a restricted area, and I don't need to justify my orders to you." Aisha exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "That's where you're wrong." For the first time there was something different in her voice, a shift in tone, subtle but undeniable. She wasn't just pushing back anymore, she was warning him. Knox didn't like warnings. "Step outside. Now." The way he said it, harsh, final, made something in the air crackle with tension. Aisha took another step closer. "Or what?" she asked softly. Knox narrowed his eyes. "Or I'll remove you myself." And that was it. That was the final mistake. Because before Aisha could respond, he reached out again, this time gripping her wrist, with full intention of dragging her out himself. But before he could move another inch, a voice shouted from down the hallway. "Officer Knox, stop!" The words hit like a thunderclap. Everyone turned to look. A young court clerk, Michael Torres, was sprinting toward them, his face pale with panic. The papers in his hands slipped and scattered across the marble floor. But he didn't stop. Knox frowned. "Torres, what the hell?" Michael's next words shattered everything. "That's Judge Carter." A crushing silence fell over the hallway. Knox felt his pulse slam against his ribs. His grip on Aisha's wrist loosened instantly, as if her skin had suddenly turned to fire. No, that wasn't possible. "Judge?" His mouth went dry as he turned, really looked at her for the first time. Aisha Carter stood still, watching him, the weight of the moment pressing down like an avalanche. Her name wasn't on his radar, because he never thought to ask. He never considered that the woman he was trying to forcibly remove from the courthouse could be someone with actual authority. And now, the truth was crashing down around him. Whispers spread like wildfire. A judge, a sitting judge, and he had just put his hands on her. Knox's breath came fast and shallow. His vision blurred at the edges. He could feel the stares, the judgment, the disbelief. His own fellow officers were watching him now, their expressions unreadable. Then came Aisha's voice, quiet, controlled. "Take your hand off me." Knox yanked his arm back, as if he had been burned. Aisha straightened her suit sleeve, smoothing out the fabric, never breaking eye contact. I didn't know, Knox stammered. Her gaze didn't waver. You didn't care to know. Another heavy silence. And then, in the most chillingly authoritative voice he had ever heard, she turned her head slightly and spoke a single command. Bailiff. A pause. Take him into custody. For the first time in his life, Officer Bradley Knox felt fear. The moment Aisha Carter uttered those 4 words, take him into custody, the world seemed to shift. Officer Bradley Knox felt his stomach drop. His breath hitched in his throat. For the first time in his entire career, he wasn't the one in control. The silence in the courthouse was deafening. The air, once thick with tension, had transformed into something even heavier. Judgment. Aisha's words hung in the space between them, final and unshakable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The authority in her tone carried more weight than any badge ever could. Knox swallowed hard, his throat dry. He opened his mouth, desperate to form words, some excuse, some justification, anything. But nothing came out. Instead, 2 officers stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. They weren't just any officers, they were his colleagues, the same men he had worked with for years. And now, they were coming for him. His feet felt like they were cemented to the ground as the 2 officers flanked him. One of them, Sergeant Tom Willis, a man Knox had patrolled the streets with countless times, looked him in the eye. And for the first time, Knox saw something he never thought he'd see in his colleague's expression. Pity. Come on, Knox, Willis said quietly. His voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't even angry. It was just sad. Knox's pulse hammered in his ears. No, wait. This is a mistake, he stammered, shaking his head as he instinctively took a step back. I didn't know. That's the problem. Aisha interrupted, her voice sharp and precise. You didn't know, and you didn't care to find out. The words sliced through him like a blade. Knox turned wildly, searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But the faces staring at him weren't the faces of his allies anymore. They were witnesses, lawyers, clerks, bystanders, even other officers. And none of them looked like they were going to step in. A voice cut through the silence like a thunderclap. What the hell is going on here? Knox snapped his head toward the courthouse entrance just as Captain Mark Reynolds, his commanding officer, strode into the room. The relief Knox felt was immediate. His captain, his boss. This was it. This was his way out. Captain, thank God. Listen, this is a huge misunderstanding, Knox blurted out. They're trying to arrest me, but I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't know who she was. Reynolds stopped in his tracks. His eyes flicked from Knox to the 2 officers restraining him. And then, his gaze landed on Aisha Carter. For a split second, something flashed across the captain's face. Recognition, respect. And then, understanding. Knox saw it the moment Reynolds realized exactly what had happened. And the moment Knox realized, Reynolds wasn't going to save him. Jesus Christ, Reynolds muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. He let out a slow breath before pinching the bridge of his nose, as if he already knew the damage was irreversible. Then he straightened, his tone cold and clipped. Is it true? Knox blinked. What? Did you lay hands on Judge Carter? Knox felt his entire body go numb. The way Reynolds said it. Judge Carter. Not this woman, not this person, but Judge Carter. The title alone carried a weight Knox wasn't ready to face. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. I didn't realize she was... I didn't ask if you knew. Reynolds snapped. I asked if you did it. Knox opened his mouth, then shut it again. His pulse roared in his ears. Aisha hadn't moved. She was still standing exactly where she had been when this all started. Unshaken, unmoved, untouchable. And Knox? Knox was unraveling. "Captain, please," he tried again. "This doesn't have to." The courthouse doors slammed open. Every head turned. A uniformed officer strode in, a folder clutched tightly in his hands. His expression was stiff, his steps measured. Knox's heart stopped. No, it couldn't be. The officer walked straight to Captain Reynolds and handed him the folder. Reynolds took it, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His lips pressed into a thin line. And then he lifted his gaze, straight to Knox. "Officer Bradley Knox," Reynolds said, his voice flat. "You're under arrest." A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Knox's entire body locked up. Number. His lungs squeezed tight. His vision swam. This couldn't be happening. "For what?" he choked out. Reynolds held up the document. "For the unlawful assault of a sitting judge." The words slammed into him like a freight train. Knox felt the room tilt beneath him. No. His own brothers in uniform grabbed him, their hands moving toward his belt, toward his badge, his lifeline, his power, the thing that had made him untouchable. Until today. Knox struggled, panic gripping his chest. "Wait, please." Nobody listened. Nobody cared. Because today, Officer Bradley Knox wasn't the one enforcing the law. He was the one facing it. The weight of the handcuffs around his wrists felt heavier than anything Officer Bradley Knox had ever carried. He had cuffed countless people in his career. He had done it so often that the sound of metal clicking shut barely registered in his mind anymore. But now, it was different. Now, it was his wrists that were bound, his freedom that was being stripped away, his authority that had been shattered. And the worst part, no one in the room looked surprised. The officers who had once stood beside him, the lawyers who had nodded in acknowledgement as he walked the halls, the clerks who had greeted him in passing, all of them now looked at him differently. Some with disappointment, some with silent judgment, and some with satisfaction. Knox's chest tightened as he turned back toward Aisha Carter. She hadn't moved. She hadn't flinched. She was still standing there tall and composed, watching him unravel. "This is a mistake," Knox hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. Aisha tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No, Officer Knox, the mistake was yours." Her voice was calm yet razor-sharp, the kind of voice that carried power, the kind of voice that made people listen, the kind of voice that Knox had ignored, until now. A cough broke the silence. Captain Mark Reynolds exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. He had just finished reading the official charges, and now looked at Knox with something between exhaustion and disgust. "Let's go," Reynolds muttered, nodding to the officers at Knox's sides. They moved to guide him forward. Knox stiffened, his body reacting before his pride could stop him. "Wait." The officers hesitated. Knox took a breath, his mind spinning, trying to find something, anything, that could turn this around. He looked at Aisha again, his heart pounding. "Judge Carter, please," he said, forcing his voice to stay even. "I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" Aisha cut him off instantly. "If you had known?" she repeated, her eyes narrowing. "You mean, if I had fit your expectations? If I had looked the way you thought a judge should look?" Knox felt his stomach sink. Aisha stepped forward, closing the distance between them by a single step. And yet somehow Knox felt like he was the one shrinking. "Tell me, Officer Knox," she continued, her tone steady. "How many others?" Knox blinked. "What?" Aisha's gaze didn't waver. How many other people have you treated this way? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Aisha inhaled slowly, then exhaled, her expression unreadable. Because I refuse to believe I was the first. The words hit like a hammer to his chest. Because she was right. She wasn't the first. And deep down, Knox knew it. His entire career, he had operated the same way. He had assumed. He had judged. He had acted before asking. And no one had ever stopped him. Until today. His hands trembled against the cuffs, sweat pooling at the base of his neck. The crowd watching was silent, but the weight of their presence was suffocating. Knox turned back to Reynolds, his breath coming faster now. "Captain, please," he said, his voice cracking. Reynolds just shook his head. "You did this to yourself, Knox?" The finality in his tone made Knox's legs weak. He turned one last time to Aisha. "I'm not a bad cop," he said, the words tumbling out faster than he could control. "I've put my life on the line for this city. I've arrested criminals. I've protected people. And how many of those people looked like me?" Aisha's voice cut through his words like a blade. Knox's breath stilled, because he knew the answer, and it wasn't one he was proud of. Aisha held his gaze for a moment longer, before finally turning away. She had nothing left to say to him, and somehow, that silence was worse than anything she could have said. Reynolds gave a stiff nod to the officers beside Knox. "Take him." They obeyed. Knox didn't resist, not because he didn't want to fight, but because for the first time in his life, he realized there was nothing left to fight for. The whispers followed him as he was led out of the courthouse. The sound of cameras clicking, reporters murmuring, the murmur of justice being served. He heard it all, and he knew in his gut his life would never be the same. Aisha stood near the judge's bench, her eyes still locked on the spot where Knox had just stood. A voice broke her thoughts. "Judge Carter." She turned. Captain Reynolds was watching her carefully, his hands clasped behind his back. "I want you to know," he said, after a long pause, "we're not all like him." Aisha let out a slow breath. "I know." Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. "He's finished. His career is over. And whatever happens next, he deserves it." Aisha studied him for a moment. Then she said simply, "I hope so." Reynolds sighed. "What now?" Aisha looked past him, toward the courtroom doors. The world outside was watching. This case, this moment, was bigger than just her, bigger than just Knox. This wasn't just about one cop. This was about all the others like him. She turned back to Reynolds, her expression unreadable. "Now," she repeated. A pause. Then finally, "Now, we see if justice truly means something." She stepped forward, walking past him without another word. And as she left the courtroom behind, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle in. This wasn't just about one moment. It was about all the moments that had come before it, and the change that had to come after. The courthouse halls had never felt this quiet. The echo of Bradley Knox's footsteps had long faded, yet the tension in the air remained. People were still standing in small clusters, whispering about what had just happened. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded, as if justice had finally caught up with him. Judge Aisha Carter sat behind her desk in her chambers, her fingers gently tracing the edges of a legal document. But her mind wasn't on the paperwork in front of her. It was still in that hallway, in that moment, when everything changed. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she said, her voice steady. The door creaked open, and Captain Mark Reynolds stepped inside. He closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. Aisha studied him for a moment, before leaning back in her chair. "I assume this isn't a social visit?" Reynolds sighed. rubbing a hand down his face before nodding. I wanted to talk to you about Knox. Aisha's lips pressed into a thin line. What about him? Reynolds hesitated. You know his career is over, right? There's no coming back from this. Aisha exhaled, her fingers interlocking on the desk. Good. Reynolds didn't react. He just nodded slowly. I figured you'd say that. He took a breath, then continued. Internal Affairs is already conducting their review. They'll be going through all his past cases. Aisha's gaze sharpened. They should. And they will, Reynolds confirmed. But Carter, let me ask you something. He stepped forward, lowering his voice. Was that enough for you? Aisha frowned. What do you mean? Reynolds crossed his arms. Knox is done. His career is over. He's humiliated. He'll likely face charges, maybe even prison time. But what about the system that let him get away with it for so long? What about the other officers who think just like him, but haven't been caught yet? Aisha's jaw tightened. That was the real question, wasn't it? Knox wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of something much bigger, a system that had protected him, a system that had allowed him to act without consequence, a system that had looked the other way, until today. Aisha sighed, shaking her head. This isn't just about Knox, she admitted. This is about all the people like him, the ones who never got caught. Reynolds nodded. So, what are we going to do about it? There was something about the way he said we that made Aisha pause. You tell me, Captain. Reynolds studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke. I'm going to push for mandatory racial bias training in the department. I'm going to fight for a complete review of past misconduct reports. And I'm going to make sure that officers like Knox don't get to hide behind a badge anymore. Aisha raised an eyebrow. And what's stopping the system from protecting them like it always has? Reynolds' expression hardened. Me? Aisha considered him carefully. For years, she had seen men like him talk about change, only for things to stay the same. But something in his tone, something real, told her this time was different. She nodded. Then let's get to work. Reynolds exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, tugging at the corner of his lips. Yes, ma'am. As he turned to leave, Aisha leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. This was just the beginning. Bradley Knox had fallen, but there were many more still standing, and she wasn't done yet. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched forward. The story of Officer Bradley Knox's downfall had already spread like wildfire. Judge Aisha Carter walked down the stairs, her face composed, her steps measured. She had been in courtrooms for years, had presided over cases that carried weight and consequence, but today felt different. Today wasn't just about one man's actions. It was about a system that had protected him for far too long. A reporter called out, Judge Carter, do you think Officer Knox got what he deserved? She stopped. The crowd hushed, waiting. Aisha's gaze swept over the sea of expectant faces. Justice is not about what someone deserves, she said finally, her voice carrying through the noise. It's about accountability. The silence stretched for a moment before another reporter spoke up. Do you think this will change anything? Aisha didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, back toward the courthouse, back toward the institution that had allowed men like Knox to operate unchecked for years. Then, she turned back to the reporters. It has to. She didn't wait for another question. She stepped off the last stair and walked toward her car. The battle wasn't over, but today, it had begun. Bradley Knox sat in the back of a squad car, staring blankly out the window. His mind was racing, but for the first time, He had no control over what happened next. The weight of his badge, his uniform, his entire career, all of it, though, had been stripped away in an instant. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. Now he was just another man in cuffs. The car slowed to a stop. The door opened, and an officer, one of his own, looked at him with an expression Knox had never seen directed at himself before. Pity. "Time to go," the officer said. Knox hesitated for just a second. Then, for the first time in his life, he stepped out into a world where he was no longer the one in power. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be powerless. The downfall of Officer Bradley Knox is more than just a dramatic moment of justice. It's a reflection of systemic issues that exist in the real world. His arrest wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a mindset that has gone unchecked for too long. This story teaches us several key lessons. Power without accountability leads to corruption. Knox believed his badge made him untouchable, until it didn't. Authority should never be a shield for misconduct. Bias can blind us to the truth. Knox assumed Aisha Carter didn't belong, simply because of her race. His failure to question his own prejudice led to his downfall. Silence enables injustice. For years, people like Knox operated without consequences. It took someone standing up, in this case, Judge Carter, to force change. How can we apply this? Challenge assumptions. Ask yourself, are your judgments based on facts or bias? Hold people in power accountable. Laws exist, but they mean nothing without enforcement. Use your voice. Whether it's reporting misconduct, voting for policy changes, or speaking out, change starts with action. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about creating a system where stories like this don't have to happen again. Imagine witnessing wrongdoing right in front of you, whether at work, in your community, or on the street. Would you speak up and take a stand for what's right, even if it comes with risks? 1. Stay silent and avoid getting involved to protect yourself. 2. There's no easy answer, but justice only exists when people are willing to fight for it. Drop a comment with 1 or 2 below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story.